Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is part 2 of Mike and Mundo. Mike, we're back.
We are back, and I'd like to thank everybody for their comments and want to encourage you folks to continue to comment and give us feedback so that we know what you want to hear and if you actually like what you're hearing now.
The title of this segment is The Death Penalty. Which is a topic that I think right down our alley, as a matter of speaking. I don't know about you, but did you ever do time in the shelf?
I did, yeah.
And the shelf is, of course, go ahead and explain.
Yeah, the shelf is death row. It's you have North Block is at that time where the chamber was at. It was a gas chamber. And so North Block, when you were either pending charges, as we oftentimes were,
right,
then they put you on the shelf or they put you in the overflow in the adjustment center.
San Quentin.
Right. I think the most interesting thing I find about the death penalty, and we're talking about the legitimate death penalty that's imposed by the voters of the state of California, who continually vote to keep the death penalty in. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, but from our perspective, as former members of organized crime, is that we imposed the death penalty ourselves. I mean, how many times have we heard that people will do things on penalty of death, and that was the truth. Right. So there were certain things that, for instance, the population in general, not just gangs, would not tolerate. Child immediately come to mind.
Yes.
So that if a molester came onto the yard, they were immediately marked for death, as it relates to that. But whenever we're having a discussion, and I've had many discussions about the death penalty because I have numerous friends that are on death row or who were on death row and have since passed over. But to begin the conversation is to acknowledge that we ourselves, as former gang members, imposed the death penalty upon the population in which we resided.
And we were prime candidates, if you will. Nothing to boast about whatsoever, but that was part of our life back then. We've often talked in private about the transition from that life and the mindset that we possessed when we were doing what we were doing, understanding fully that upon apprehension, to kill somebody behind bars is something we were more than ready to do. I can't speak about certain events because there's no statute of limitations. Right. And you know how that works. We both were performing and co-conspiring to do things that have no statute of limitations. So that makes us and made us prime candidates for capital punishment, for the death penalty. So we had, I like to say that death was my constant companion. And I think that's the story of a career criminal when you're doing time behind bars, and that may be the story of your average inmate in a prison, because that death can always touch them.
That's the shadow, isn't it?
Yes.
When we talk about shadows, that's one of the primary shadows, is the potential for death on any given day. And whether at the hands of a rival gang, another prisoner, or the state itself. I mean, what are the stats now on the death penalty here in California? How many people do we have?
I think it's over 1,000 inmates, and Governor Newsom has declared himself not only an opponent of the death penalty, but unwilling to enforce the will of the people. And I believe he dismantled the gas chamber, and he made a stay. I think his statement was, as long as he's governor of California, which potentially could include a second term, that he would not enforce the death penalty. So things have taken place, as we'll get into.
Moratorium, is that what they call it?
I believe you're right. So it's a moratorium. I remember a few years ago when talking to someone from that worked on death row, there were over 800 condemned men, and now there's over 1,000. enjoying condemned status, but they're not being enforced. They're not going to be executed under the watch of Governor Newsom.
One of the some of the pushback, rather, that I've seen on that, there's a petition currently in San Bernardino County, the Chino area. You remember the old case of Cooper?
Yeah.
There at Chino, he's alleged to have escaped, and in the process of that, took a family hostage and killed. I know that there are some celebrities working on that. They don't believe that he was the actual person, but that's where the upheaval comes from, particularly with the moratorium on the death penalty itself, because what's happening as a result of that moratorium is that individuals, condemned prisoners, are being released from death row to level 2 prisons, facilities.
Right. Exactly.
Now, the reason that's happening is because they've been on death row so long that they don't have any points. The California Department of Corrections functions on a point system by way of custody and classification wise. So that because they have not acquired any points because of their status on death row, they qualify for what's called level 2. Because they're lifers, they can't go below level 2. That's 56 points, I think, is what it is. And so they can't go below 56 points, and so they qualify for level 2. So what's happening is that these individuals, these condemned prisoners, are being sent to level 2 facilities. And I know individuals, like I said, on death row who have arrived at these level 2 facilities, and they love it. They love the opportunities that it provides, to attend church with other people, to engage in educational activities, to engage in drug addiction type programs, to essentially broaden their worldview. And so in that context, I think it's a good thing. Now, the other side of that, unfortunately, is that
you got the flip side.
Yeah, you do.
You have the characters, all the
that's it.
The demented, the career criminals who, if you listen to them and their advocates, they're not guilty of their crimes to begin with, and since they've been convicted and adjudicated and sentenced to death, they continue to operate on behalf of their organizations, disseminating instructions. One person that comes to mind is Ronnie Ayala, Mexican Mafia member.
Yeah, I know Ronnie.
And Ronnie has been involved and still is an active member. And as an active member, anybody who knows about that world understands that if you're active, you're involved in criminal activities that leads to having people killed.
Yes.
In the furtherance of their enterprise, in the furtherance of their criminal business. So you have a man like Ronnie, who not only was conducting this kind of business from death row, but when he leaves death row, courtesy of our governor, Governor Newsom, he now has carte blanche, in effect, by way of accessing cell phones a lot more easier, to communicate, to hold conference calls on a daily basis upon demand. He can speak with people from Mexico, from the U.S. side, in a federal prison, in another state prison. Together, they arrive at a decision to have people killed. That is something that when you think about, we're going to weigh in on the death penalty, on how we feel about it and why. But cases like that, instances like that, create exceptions. I believe, and you're going to expound on one of your reasons, which I think is a valid reason. I believe the only person that can take a life is God, our Creator. Again, that's just my way of looking at things now after the life that I lived. I know it sounds hypocritical, but I was a different person when I was taking lives, and now as a redeemed man, I do believe that only God can take our lives. But I do subscribe to the notion that there are exceptions, and you, Mike, have talked about that. I
have, yeah. I mean, I take issue. It goes back to the idea I talked previously about if a child molester came onto the yard, that the death penalty from the prisoner perspective was imposed immediately.
Yes.
And many prisoners who were there for child molestation, their lives were taken. We both know that.
That's why they keep them separated.
It is
general pop.
And the case here, though, is that whether or not the death penalty should be imposed at all. And I do take exception because when you're dealing with a serial killer, when you're dealing with somebody who has molested a child, and you have many serial molesters relative to that, as well as having taken the child's life, you have those individuals who, in my opinion, have created psychological murder. They may not have taken the child's life, but they've imposed psychological murder upon that child by the very act of the molestation. And I do take issue with that. I'm of the opinion that if you're not going to impose the death penalty upon that caliber of individual, then they should be incarcerated for the rest of their life. How we do that as a society is an entirely different issue. But at issue today is the value of the death penalty. We hear a lot of talk about the death penalty. I think you made reference one time to Texas, insofar as it being a deterrent.
Yes. Yeah, Texas is Texas is a prime example of a state that not only has the death penalty on the books, but enforces the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that's the law of the land. And even though I oppose the death penalty as a believer in Christ today, I also realize that there is a scripture that says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Now, I take that, many people take that to believe that it applies only to paying your taxes. I believe it goes further than that. I believe it's a respect to a civilized nation, any civilized nation that has a state or a law in place that warrants the death penalty for certain crimes. So in that case, okay, you do implement the death penalty. So Texas is an example of a state that does implement the death penalty. But the question there is, does it deter homicides? Does it deter murders and gang homicides as well? And my answer to that is no.
Right.
It does not. You still have the gang activity, the increase in homicides taking place. So why not just call a spade a spade? The reason we're implementing the death penalty is so that that person can never again kill another person. You call a spade, you let the voters weigh in, and if they voted in place, then you enforce the law of the land. So now getting back to California, of course, we have people who are defeating the notion of another idea that you brought up and that I agree with you on. You talked about the way that the death penalty is disproportionately applied.
It is in a number of ways. I mean, of course, you always have the racial issue, but the fact of the matter is that the dominant race in the United States as it relates to those individuals on death row is white, 42% black, and the rest Hispanic and Asian. And we're not even talking about the women at this point, because they too are subject to the death penalty. I can remember that originally death row was in Tehachapi. And then, later, I think it was in, when they had the earthquake there in Tehachapi in 1936, they moved it to San Quentin.
Right.
But, your point is taken. My interest in the death penalty is the vetting process relative to capital crime in general. First and foremost, it's the district attorney that makes that determination as to whether or not the death penalty will be sought in a particular type of case. So, I get it where you have an individual who takes it upon himself to kill a cop, execution style, and so you would certainly anticipate that the prosecution would pursue the death penalty in that case. But otherwise, that vetting process seems totally disproportionate to me insofar as the type of crime committed, how it was committed, and otherwise. And
right.
it's strictly up to the district attorney to decide as to whether or not he or she will pursue the death penalty. Then again, I look at the idea of the Innocence Project, for instance, that I think to date over 400 individuals have been removed from death row and their convictions overturned as a result of DNA evidence, which is huge. So I don't think we're ever going to get away from the prospect that mistakes are made.
Right.
And, and I tend to agree with you in that, the taking of a life by the state is a serious thing. And so that in the taking of that life, I think that you're unable to guarantee that 100% conviction.
Correct.
We all know that you have corruption, and oftentimes the prosecution is pursuing a case with just the idea of winning, not necessarily justice. And so those are the variables, and that's part of the human condition. And I think as long as we have that, that it creates a problem insofar as taking an individual's life. Now, in those instances where you have a clear-cut case, that's an entirely different thing. And I personally don't believe in the death penalty. And that's on moral grounds, ethical grounds.
Right.
The idea that the state is going to take life doesn't make any sense to me when we're talking about a civilized society.
And it may sound self-serving in the sense that we're former convicted felons,
yes.
former convicted
who imposed the
murderers.
death penalty ourselves.
Right. Exactly. So we resemble those remarks that we're talking about, but at the same time, I think that we're qualified to weigh in on the topic, and rightly or wrongly, people are going to disagree on whether to enforce it, to implement it, or not. So we're not going to solve anything in that regard by this conversation, but we're gonna generate or stimulate some thought, some conversation, and some understanding into the fact that there are people who do in fact deserve. I was a candidate, like I said earlier. I deserved it at one time, according to the law. I was blessed. I was able to pull away and reverse my life, and I think the same applies to you as well. You can say the same thing, and so now we can look at things through a different prism. We're not looking at it through those eyes. If we looked at it through those eyes, we're innocent of everything.
Well, the thing to remember is that prism is multifaceted.
Right.
I have friends who were originally on death row and had their sentence commuted to life without the possibility of parole, and then ultimately were paroled and are law-abiding citizens. I mean, living their life.
There you go.
They spent many, many years behind the iron gates, but nonetheless, through their own process of change, have brought about that change. And, we oftentimes talk about this issue of redemption and making amends,
right,
and otherwise. And I think just the very idea that they're able to make that transition, to make that change, says a lot for the idea that the death penalty doesn't work, or perhaps shouldn't work.
It's funny, as I hear you saying that, if you live long enough, and we have, you will see the pendulum swing from rehabilitation to punishment and back to rehabilitation. The CDCR, for example, used to be CDC,
right,
California Department of Corrections.
Right.
They added the R to create a narrative, and I'm sure there were some well-intentioned people that did want to rehabilitate.
That was Arnold who did that, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So they wanted to rehabilitate. They wanted people to maybe think that there were facilities in place for rehabilitation, and I do believe that there were. But the thing is, you have to have people that wish to avail themselves of those facilities, of those institutions within the prisons to change. And if inmates don't want to change, you can't force that upon them.
How well we know that. I mean, what you're essentially saying is they have to come to that of their own volition.
Right.
And if that doesn't happen, then that change isn't going to occur.
Right. So now you take people off of death row and you mix them in with the general population, as you say, as low as level 2, but even level 3 and level 4 yards. You're talking mixing them with general pop.
Right.
So that's like telling a doctor, don't perform a surgery to isolate that cancer, because after all, the body is the body. don't worry about it.
Yeah, let it be what it be.
Exactly. You can't do that. You have to isolate these cancers, the people who wish to continue to promote death and violence, the people who do not care about rehabilitation. They've essentially erased the R in CDCR.
The fascinating thing about that is that I have to believe, I think we both do, knowing the Department of Corrections the way that we do, and the politic associated with that, not the least of which, is the Guards Union and the influence that they have on that politic.
Right.
But you have to believe that the Department of Correction knows, those individuals who are in the mix with gangs that are being released to level 2 facilities and using that as an opportunity to expand their network, to create infrastructures,
right,
to generate revenues, to assign assassinations contracts.
Right.
They have to know that. But unfortunately, it would appear under the law that they cannot make that distinction, that if they allow one, then they have to allow all.
Right.
And that's the problem we face.
They're probably afraid that you either let everybody off death row the way they've done and leave themselves open to whatever comes their way. And I don't know how the death penalty will be forced upon the state of California when you have political animals playing games with they're literally playing a game with that issue. And it's sad, and you figure it's not just about the inmates, the ones who deservedly so should suffer that fate, but you have the families of the victims.
Yes.
I mean, who better to speak about that than those of us who have been responsible for making families victims of crime?
Well, I think that's actually why the idea of Victims' Bill of Rights was enacted. That goes toward that, consideration,
Right.
To the families. And that certainly applies to the death penalty, but I think it applies across the board to any crime. I mean, I served 45 years for a double homicide, and my expectation was that I would never be released from prison.
Yeah.
But it was actually one of the victim's daughters who came to my parole hearing and spoke on my behalf.
Wow.
I think that made a huge difference, in that. So, and the reason in even mentioning that is that what we're really talking about here are variables and how those variables interact to create a situation where you can plainly see that there's an opportunity here, not only for redemption and making amends, but toward our humanity, and what it means to be human.
Right. And if you're going to have a death penalty, I think there should be a formula for extracting those that are well-deserved. I know the law, the definition of the law dumps everybody into that category upon conviction, but you do have people on death row that probably are innocent, and many will say that should be enough to not enforce the death penalty. Whatever the reasons are, I think that people should have an open mind to consider those people, like we're saying, mass murderers, child molesters, people who are 150% guilty, as opposed to just circumstantial evidence convictions, maybe.
Right.
I think as far as the implementation, the classification of inmates, especially after they've taken them off the death row. Okay, you're off death row. You should be able to have a classification system that recognizes who the pariah are, who represents the cancer in that population. I would nominate you or I,
yes,
for governor or for director. I think they call him secretary now. Secretary of the Department of Corrections. I think we would know 10 times better how to classify and separate these people. I think the Department of Corrections has people in place today, top-notch gang investigators, IGIs,
yes,
who know exactly which guys should be separated, how they should house them, and if they're incommunicado for a period of time, sometimes, well, you're feeding them, you're giving them their exercise, and they've brought that upon themselves.
yes.
You know,
It's a direct consequence of that involvement, of being in the mix. I mean, in listening to you, what comes to mind is you do have those individuals, those gang investigators and otherwise, that are fully aware of what they're dealing with. And I say that because at one point they came to me and asked me to do a film for members of the legislature here in California. And that was in relationship to releasing individuals from the SHU units. And so they were attempting to effectively utilize me via the gang investigators as a resource. The problem is that they didn't listen because politics got in the way.
right.
And I think that's always going to be a problem.
That's sad. That's sad that has to exist to that degree. You would think that they would know what their job description is. Now they have to hear it from somebody of our ilk, so to speak.
Right.
And they can easily poo-poo our input and say, what do they know? These guys did this and that, and they were the authors of violence. They were the authors of evil. And I think we're probably more qualified to speak than many of their administrators. Administrators/politicians.
I'm in agreement.
If I sound harsh, against administrators, I am. The rank and file, like in any law enforcement group, I think they want to do their jobs. I think they want to be empowered to do their jobs. You got police officers throughout the country who probably feel helpless to a similar degree. They are vilified. The bad guys are declared victims. You see photographs of some of these people, these suspects, and they show pictures of them in church or something. They don't show pictures of them when they're showing their gang signs or any of that. And that's the kind of attitude I think that prevails. You have people with no backbone, people that are afraid, and that's on the administrative level, on the political level. I don't know who they think they're pleasing by doing this and then declaring during election time that they're tough on crime. I don't see how people don't see through that.
Well, that is the politic, but we could talk for days about that very issue. Why people unfortunately don't see essentially the writing on the wall. And there are a multitude of reasons for that. That diversity is what makes actually this country what it is. And so it's hard to argue against that. But as it relates to the death penalty, I think what we'd like to do is invite our viewers to weigh in, and what do you think about the death penalty and why? And perhaps we can address some of those issues in further episodes.
That's right. Well, we did expound to the best of our ability. We love having you on board. We're going to touch on many topics. We even talked about the topic of watching paint dry. And we thought that would be a good topic, but I think Mike turned me down on that one.
Yeah, I think that's going a bit far.
A little too far there. So we are going to touch on many, some controversial, some not. We're not on the air just for the sake of being controversial.
No.
I think we do love stimulating thought, and I'm just honored. I'm glad to be on board with Mike, and knowing that he's done a similar thing. We're gonna have another episode in the future discussing the change of life, how we turned our life around. And I think there's a lot of bonding that goes on.
There is, yeah. I mean, so the point is, stay with us. I think you're going to enjoy yourself as we do, and go with us on the journey. And I think you're going to have a good time.